I have decided to nerd out even further and cover each short story within his short story collections instead of the collection as a whole. Hi guys, and welcome to Stephen King Sematary Club. Night Shift was published in 1978, and there is a foreword from Stephen King himself. Someone else introduced it, but Stephen King wrote the foreword. I read all of Stephen King's forewords. I really enjoy them. I like when he talks to us, you know, it's meaningful, because otherwise you have no idea what the author is thinking or what kind of relationship he has with you. And there are two things in here that I find have always stuck with me. Quote, "The thing under my bed waiting to grab my ankle isn't real. I know that, and I also know that if I'm careful to keep my foot under the covers, it will never be able to grab my ankle." And then the other part is, quote, "In civilized society, we have an unspoken agreement to call our obsessions hobbies." And that is so true. So the first short story in Night Shift is Jerusalem's Lot. And this is basically the history of Salem's Lot. Our protagonist is Charles Boone, and he has inherited a house. And it's a very gothic, creepy, overgrown yard, lots of land, and it kind of makes me think of like Scooby-Doo, or like something you'd see out of a Dracula film, you know, House on the Hill, on the cliffside, so maybe something like a Dark Shadows even, and it's just spooky, and you've got the sea and the crashing waves and the isolation, and this house is in a town where people are superstitious and don't take kindly to his family lineage, and his house came to him by way of a cousin. And what happened is they had a falling out between their grandfathers. So the grandfathers argued, didn't want to be around each other anymore, that kind of thing. And Charles's grandfather moved away and then just, you know, started raising his family away from this town. And Stephen's family, Stephen Boone is the cousin, he stayed there, and they passed the house on down and all that stuff. So this is like the reconnection of the family. So in this book, it's taking place in 1850, and it's called the Chapelwaite house. Charles is living there with a companion named Calvin, and he had lost his wife. She died, and he developed some sort of a sickness. He was ill afterward and was kind of slightly insane from this illness, which has bearing on the story. And now he's better, and he and Calvin have gone to live in Chapelwaite. It's told through letters that Charles writes to his friend Bones, to a couple other people, and Calvin keeps a journal. So some of the stuff is told that way. And Calvin writes, quote, "Anyone who would live in Chapelwaite must be either a lunatic or run the risk of becoming one." That's on page 3. And it's a huge house, like a mansion. And there are noises in the walls, like huge rats. Calvin and Charles keep hearing like rustling and rummaging and scratching noises coming from the walls. And from the sounds of it, the rats are big. So we also have a letter where Richard is inquiring about a nearby town that's deserted, and it's called Jerusalem's Lot. There's a cleaning lady, Mrs. Cloris, who comes to the house, and she says, quote, "The house was built in unhappiness, has been lived in with unhappiness. There's been blood spilt on its floors." Page 7. And she talks about these noises in the walls, and Charles Boone kind of mocks her, and he says, "Well, you know, do you think there are ghosts here, you silly woman?" And she says, quote, "Some die not, Some live in the twilight shadows between to serve him. Page 7. So Calvin hears scratching and laughter coming from the walls, and he and Charles kind of investigate, and they find a map of Jerusalem's lot, and they decide to set out and go explore this deserted town. So it's very intact, except for, what natural weather would do to it over the years. They go to the church in this town. Quote, any godliness or sanctity had departed from it long ago, on page 11. So inside there's obscene artwork and an upside-down cross, and this pulpit contains a book, and it's written in Latin and runes, and it's called The Mysteries of the Worm. You have a little bill of sale type thing. Calvin sends away for some rat poison. Quote, the noises in the house have intensified, and I'm growing more to the conclusion that rats are not all that move within our walls. So Charles and Calvin have run into problems with the nearby townspeople. They do not like them, and they are not afraid to show it. They have thrown stones at Calvin. They, one of the people who was supposed to deliver wood didn't deliver wood, and so Charles went to go kind of ask about it, like, what's the holdup? We ordered wood to, come to our house, and you guys haven't delivered it. What's up with that? And the guy flips out when Charles arrives, and he forks the evil eye at him and starts threatening to shoot him. Charles is kind of disturbed by all this behavior, and he seeks out the cleaning lady, Mrs. Cloris, to ask her, if she could shed light on the situation and let him know what's going on. So she tells Charles that Philip Boone, who would have been Stephen's grandfather, had the mark of the beast on him, and he disappeared on the 31st of October in 1789, along with the entire village of Jerusalem's Lot. Jerusalem's Lot had been run by this man named James Boone. He's old, he has a harem of women, he's been reproducing with all of these women. There's a lot of interbreeding and insanity. Philip was studying under James Boone. He worshipped him, he was following him around. He inquired about the book, the Worm book, and he got Robert to ask for this book from a friend of his, and his friend gave the book to Robert. He sent the book on to Robert and then said, basically, I don't want anything to do with you anymore after this. I know what this book is, and, I don't like it. And the brothers fought over this, the grandfather of Stephen and the grandfather of Charles. So Philip and Robert Boone this is their falling out. They fell out over this evil book. Basically, this original Jerusalem's Lot was filled with crazy people who worshipped this worm, and they were evil, kind of creepy, inbred people, and it killed them in the end. The power of this worm that corrupted their entire town. Charles's uncle Randolph, he was involved in some sort of accident on the cellar stairs that killed his daughter Marcella, and then he killed himself. He hung himself in a fit of remorse or whatever. So the history of the house is quite sordid. So in order to find out what all these rat noises are, Charles and Calvin go down into the cellar, which is where the daughter died and the father died. And they go down there and they see terrible creatures that aren't really apparitions. They are actual creatures, and they have this kind of face off with them where they actually throw things at them and have to run away. So the description of these creatures is quite good. A face leered, a face with eyes as ebon as the Styx itself. Its mouth yawned in a toothless, agonized grin. One yellow, rotted hand stretched itself out to us. It made a hideous mewling sound and took a shambling step forward. The light from a candle fell upon it, and I saw the livid rope burn around its neck. From beyond it, something else moved, something I shall dream of until the day when all dreams cease. A girl with a pallid, moldering face and a corpse grin. A girl whose head lolled at a lunatic angle. They wanted us, I know it. And I know they would have drawn us into that darkness and made us their own, had I not thrown my candle directly at the thing in the partition and followed it with the chair beneath that noose. So that's all on page 20. Charles and Calvin go back to the church and they decide they're going to destroy this Book of the Worm because that is probably the source of all of this. And they go and craziness ensues. A hole opens up from underneath them and the worm comes out, and so does James Boone. It's a very interesting scene. Charles escapes, but Calvin does not. And Charles decides that he does have to kill himself, though, because he is the last of the Boone family line, and with his death, everything would just, be broken. The lineage, all that stuff. So, and then we find out that he has killed himself, and people ascribe it to his condition that reoccurred after his wife's death and all that, when he had the kind of like insane ravings and kind of like a brain fever type situation. So people think that that reoccurred and that he is the one who killed Calvin and then himself. We find that all of this story has come out because there is in fact another person who is the actual last of the line of the Boone family, and his name is James Robert Boone. He was an illegitimate child that no one knew about, so technically this evil can still continue. He's residing at Chapelwaite in 1971, so he has published these letters and diary excerpts just to give history of the Chapelwaite house and the history of the Boone family. He basically says, what Charles Boone did have correct was that there are rats, and quote, there are some huge rats in the walls by the sound. So I think this would make a great movie. I find this to be an interesting concept. There's enough with the haunted house, the creepy things inside the house, the setting being like pre-Civil War, very, very quaint and isolated. And I do like how at the end it's the whole surprise of, they think the guy was crazy and that all this stuff happened because he was insane, but really, it did happen. Have a spooky day.